What became of the family of history's most methodical mass murderer? When Israeli agents seized Adolf Eichmann from a quiet suburban street in Buenos Aires on the evening of May 11, 1960, they did not simply capture a man. They ripped apart a family that had spent 15 years carefully rebuilding itself in the shadow of one of the greatest crimes ever committed against humanity. A wife, 4 sons, a community of German emigrants who knew exactly who their neighbour was and said nothing. The question of what happened to the people who loved Adolf Eichmann, who ate dinner with him, who played in the garden with him on weekends, who watched him shave in the bathroom mirror every morning, is one of history's most uncomfortable and least examined threads. And yet, it is a thread that runs directly into questions about guilt, about inheritance, about whether a son can truly separate himself from the monster his father was, and about whether justice can ever be complete when it falls only upon a single man while his family carries the consequences across generations. In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start at the very beginning, because to understand what happened to Eichmann's family after the war, you first need to understand who Adolf Eichmann truly was, what he did, how he vanished, and how the world eventually caught up with him. Adolf Otto Eichmann was born on March 19, 1906, in the small German town of Solingen in the Rhineland. He was the eldest of 5 children born to Adolf Karl Eichmann, a bookkeeper, and his wife Maria, née Schäferling. The family was of Protestant faith, solidly middle class and deeply conventional. When young Adolf was still a child, his mother died of tuberculosis, leaving his father to raise 5 children on a bookkeeper's salary. In 1914, his father relocated the family to Linz, Austria, a city that would later become famous as Adolf Hitler's hometown and the place that Hitler himself considered his true spiritual home. It is one of history's smaller ironies that 2 of the most consequential figures of the 20th century spent their early years walking the same streets of Linz, though they never met there. Eichmann attended the same school as Hitler for a brief overlapping period, though neither was aware of the other at the time. As a young man, Eichmann was an indifferent student, dropping out of a technical school before completing his degree. He drifted through a series of jobs in his early 20s, working as a travelling salesman for the Vacuum Oil Company of Austria, covering a territory in the Salzburg region. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Eichmann had acquired little in the way of accomplishment, professional distinction, or intellectual depth. He was, by most accounts, a man of decidedly ordinary intelligence and ambition, someone who might easily have passed through life without leaving any particular mark on the world at all. His former employers described him as reliable but unremarkable. His acquaintances found him socially pleasant but without strong opinions. He was, as the philosopher Hannah Arendt would later observe after watching him in a Jerusalem courtroom, the very embodiment of the banality of evil, a bureaucrat rather than a monster, a man who committed genocide not out of sadistic pleasure or radical ideology, but out of careerism, obedience, and a deeply disturbing ability to separate the paperwork from the corpses. Eichmann joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, on April 1, 1932, and the Schutzstaffel, the SS, on the same day. His entry into the party was encouraged by his friend Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a fellow Austrian who would rise to become one of the most feared men in the Third Reich. Eichmann's early years in the SS were spent in organizational roles, learning the bureaucratic machinery of the movement. In 1934, he transferred to the newly formed security service of the SS, known as the SD, and was assigned to a department dealing with Jewish affairs. This assignment would define the rest of his life and end the lives of millions of others. Through the middle years of the 1930s, Eichmann became the Nazi regime's foremost expert on Jewish organizations, Jewish emigration, and what the regime euphemistically called the Jewish question. He travelled to Palestine in 1937 to study Zionist movements firsthand, though British authorities expelled him from the country before he could complete his reconnaissance. He established the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in Vienna in 1938, following the Anschluss that incorporated Austria into the German Reich, and used it to force the emigration of approximately 100,000 Austrian Jews in a remarkably short period, using a combination of intimidation, bureaucratic efficiency, and the systematic stripping of property and assets that left Jews with no choice but to flee. He replicated this model in Prague, following the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. By the time the war began in 1939, Eichmann was already one of the most experienced and effective instruments of Jewish persecution in the Nazi state apparatus. But it was the shift from persecution to annihilation that would make Eichmann's name synonymous with the Holocaust itself. Following the Wannsee Conference of January 20th, 1942, where senior Nazi officials coordinated the implementation of what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, Eichmann was appointed head of the section of the Reich Main Security Office specifically responsible for organizing the deportation of Jews from across Europe to the extermination camps in occupied Poland. He became the chief logistics officer of the Holocaust, the man who sat in his office in Berlin and coordinated the railway timetables, the camp capacities, the transports from France, from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from Greece, from Italy, from Hungary. He negotiated with railway officials over the use of freight trains. He corresponded with camp commandants about intake capacities. He managed the machinery of death with the same methodical efficiency that a postmaster general might use to manage the delivery of mail. The scale of what Eichmann organized is almost impossible to comprehend. By the most conservative scholarly estimates, the deportation operations he coordinated directly contributed to the deaths of between 5 and 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. In Hungary alone, during the spring and summer of 1944, Eichmann personally oversaw the deportation of approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews in just 56 days, the single largest and most rapid deportation in the history of the Holocaust, at a rate of more than 7,000 people per day. This was accomplished even as German military forces were retreating on multiple fronts, even as Allied bombs were falling on German cities, even as senior military commanders were pleading for railway capacity to move troops and supplies. Eichmann insisted on using the trains. The final solution, in his view, was not a task that could wait for a more convenient moment. He was, by every measure, fanatically devoted to the extermination project. What made Eichmann particularly dangerous was not sadism or personal hatred toward Jews as individuals, though he did express anti-Semitic views when convenient. What made him dangerous was his profound organizational competence combined with his complete moral disengagement from the consequences of his work. He saw himself as an administrator, a problem solver, a man doing a difficult job efficiently. When Jewish organizations approached him with proposals for rescuing Jews in exchange for payment or goods, he negotiated with them as a businessman negotiates a contract, often stringing them along to gather intelligence about Jewish assets before crushing any hope of a deal. He was coldly transactional about death in a way that many who encountered him found more disturbing than open cruelty would have been. And throughout all of this, Adolf Eichmann was also a husband and a father. This is the detail that history sometimes struggles to accommodate because it insists on inserting the domestic into the monstrous, on reminding us that the architect of deportation and death also came home in the evenings, sat down to dinner, tucked his children into bed, and kissed his wife goodnight. His family existed in a parallel world alongside his professional activities, a world of Sunday afternoon walks and birthday celebrations and school recitals that proceeded with almost deliberate normalcy, while the trains ran and the camps operated and the chimneys burned. It is this parallel domestic world, and what became of it after the war, that forms the heart of our story today. So who was the woman who married Adolf Eichmann? Who were the 4 sons who bore his name? And what happened to them when the world finally came for the man they called husband and father? Vera Maria Liebel was born on March 29, 1909, in the small town of Mold in Lower Austria. She came from a rural Catholic background, the daughter of a farmer named Karl Liebel and his wife Theresia, née Ortner. Vera grew up in a tight-knit rural community in a region of Austria that was, in the early 20th century, deeply traditional and largely untouched by the modernizing currents sweeping through Vienna and the larger cities. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a practical woman, rather than an intellectual one, someone who valued home and family above broader ambitions, and who approached life with a certain stolid pragmatism that would prove essential to her survival in the decades ahead. Adolf Eichmann and Vera Liebel met in the early 1930s, most likely through social circles connected to the growing Nazi movement in Austria, though some accounts suggest they were introduced through mutual acquaintances, in the Linz area where Eichmann's father still lived. Whatever the circumstances of their introduction, the relationship developed quickly. By 1935, they were ready to marry, and the wedding took place on March 21st of that year, a date that fell just 3 days before Vera's birthday. It was a modest ceremony, not the grand Nazi party affair that senior officials might have arranged, but the union of two Austrians who had found each other in the middle of an era that was rapidly reshaping the world around them. The marriage of Adolf and Vera Eichmann produced 4 sons across nearly 2 decades. The first, Klaus Eichmann, was born on February 6, 1936, in Berlin, where Adolf Eichmann was by then working in the SS apparatus. Eichmann was by this point already embedded in the bureaucracy of persecution, already building the expertise in Jewish affairs that would eventually make him one of the most consequential figures in the machinery of mass murder. Klaus thus came into the world. At exactly the moment his father was beginning his ascent within that machinery, growing up in a household where his father's work was described, to whatever extent it was described at all, in the abstract language of duty and service and national mission that the Nazi regime used to dress its darkest activities in the costume of patriotism. Vera Eichmann, during these years, occupied herself with the role that the Nazi regime had designated as appropriate for women of the SS officer class, that of the devoted wife and mother, the keeper of the domestic hearth while her husband served the state. She ran the household, she managed the family's social calendar, she raised Klaus and, when he arrived, the second son, Horst, who was born in 1940. A third son, Dieter, followed in 1942. By this point, the Holocaust was well underway, and Adolf Eichmann was at the centre of its administration. Vera, in her domestic sphere, was insulated from the operational details of her husband's work, but she was not entirely ignorant of its general character. The wives of SS officers in wartime Germany existed in a state of selective knowledge, understanding enough to know that what their husbands did was terrible by any ordinary standard, but choosing to frame it within the ideological language of the regime, to see their husbands as soldiers doing what soldiers must do in service of a cause, rather than as architects of unprecedented mass murder. As the war turned against Germany in 1943 and 1944, and particularly as the Allied bombing campaign intensified, life for the Eichmann family became increasingly difficult. The comfortable certainties of the early Nazi years were crumbling. The Wehrmacht was retreating on the Eastern Front. Allied forces had landed in Italy. The air raid sirens became a constant feature of life in German cities. And yet Eichmann, stationed in Berlin, continued his work with undiminished intensity, travelling constantly to oversee deportation operations in country after country as the noose tightened around the Reich. He was in Hungary in the spring of 1944, directing what would be the largest single deportation operation of the Holocaust, even as Allied forces were massing for the Normandy invasion. He had, by this point, essentially sacrificed any semblance of normal family life on the altar of his mission. By the spring of 1945, with Germany's defeat imminent, Adolf Eichmann began to understand that the world he had served was disintegrating and that the reckoning for what he had done was likely to follow. He was not naive about his own role or its visibility. He had attended the Wannsee Conference. He had met repeatedly with Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. His name appeared in countless documents and was known to Jewish communities across Europe who had survived the transports he organised. He was, if anyone was, a man who understood that he was a marked figure. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Eichmann was in Austria, having made his way back from Czechoslovakia in the chaos of the final weeks. He surrendered to American forces but gave a false name, identifying himself as Adolf Karl Barth, an ordinary soldier of the Luftwaffe. The Americans, who did not yet know who they had caught, placed him in a prisoner of war camp. He spent the next few months moving through various camps under his false identity, before eventually escaping in the confusion of the immediate post-war period and going into hiding in the German countryside. He made contact with underground networks that were helping former SS members disappear, and for the next 4 years, he lived a fugitive existence in rural Germany, working variously as a lumberjack, a farmhand, and a chicken farmer in the Lüneburg Heath region of northern Germany under the name Otto Henninger. During these years of hiding, Vera Eichmann was left to manage on her own, which she did with the pragmatic determination that characterized everything she would do in the years that followed. She returned to Austria with the 3 boys and applied, in 1947, to have her husband declared legally dead. This was not, one should note, a sign that she had abandoned him or believed he was dead. It was a practical legal maneuver, one that would allow her to receive a widow's pension and to manage the family's affairs without the encumbrance of being married to a man who was officially a wanted war criminal. The Austrian authorities, in a reflection of the profound failure of denazification in that country, processed the declaration without difficulty. Adolf Eichmann was declared legally dead. His wife received her pension, and in the meantime the real Adolf Eichmann was making his final preparations to vanish entirely. The escape route that carried Eichmann out of Europe in 1950 was part of a broader network that historians have come to call the Rat Lines, a series of interconnected escape channels that helped thousands of former SS and Nazi officials flee justice in the immediate post-war years. These networks drew on support from a variety of sources, including former SS members who had established themselves in neutral countries, sympathetic clergy within the Catholic Church, and organizations that provided false documentation. In Eichmann's case, the critical figure was a Franciscan monk and Croatian priest named Krunoslav Draganovic, who operated out of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome. Draganovic helped Eichmann obtain an International Committee of the Red Cross humanitarian travel document in the name of Riccardo Clement, describing him as a stateless person of Italian birth. Armed with this document and an Argentine entry visa obtained through a contact at the Argentine consulate in Genoa, Eichmann boarded a ship called the Giovanna C at the port of Genoa in June 1950 and sailed to Buenos Aires. He arrived in Argentina and stepped into his new life as Riccardo Clement. Argentina, in 1950, was, from the perspective of a fugitive Nazi official, one of the more hospitable places on earth. The government of Juan Perón had pursued a deliberate policy of welcoming former Nazi and fascist officials after the war, motivated by a combination of ideological sympathy, the desire for German technical expertise, and the straightforward inducement of the funds that many fleeing Germans brought with them. Argentina had taken in not only ordinary German emigrants, but also some of the most notorious war criminals of the era, including Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief known as the Butcher of Lyon, Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor who conducted horrific medical experiments on inmates, and Erich Priebke, an SS officer responsible for a massacre in Rome. Buenos Aires and its surrounding communities became home to a substantial German community in the post-war years, with its own newspapers, social clubs, churches, and networks of mutual assistance that made it possible for men like Eichmann to live with a degree of social normalcy even while living under false names. Within a year of his arrival, Eichmann had found work at the Mercedes-Benz plant in the suburb of González Catán, where he worked as a foreman. He lived initially in a boarding house and then in rented accommodation in various suburbs of Buenos Aires. He was careful, quiet, and punctual, the kind of steady worker and unobtrusive tenant that attracts no particular attention. He attended social gatherings of the German community occasionally, but was not a prominent figure in those circles. He drank moderately, kept largely to himself, and gave nothing away. By any external measure, Riccardo Clement was an utterly forgettable middle-aged German immigrant making a modest living in the Argentine automobile industry. But within his own family, Eichmann could not disappear. He had a wife in Austria, he had 3 sons, and despite the enormous risks involved, he arranged for them to join him. This decision, as we shall see, would ultimately contribute to his undoing. Vera Eichmann and the 3 boys, Klaus, Horst, and Dieter, joined Adolf in Argentina in 1952. The logistics of this reunion required considerable organizational effort since Vera was still officially the widow of the deceased Adolf Eichmann under Austrian law, and the man she was going to join was living as Riccardo Clement. When she and the boys arrived in Buenos Aires, they too adopted the surname Clement. For the next 8 years, the Eichmann family lived a double existence in the suburbs of Argentina's capital, known to their German community acquaintances simply as the Clement family, a quiet German immigrant family trying to build a new life in South America. The Buenos Aires suburbs where the Eichmanns eventually settled were, in these years, home to a surprisingly large community of people whose true identities were similarly buried beneath false names and carefully constructed cover stories. San Fernando and the surrounding northern suburbs had become something of an informal gathering place for former Nazi officials and their families, a community held together by shared language, shared culture, shared secrets, and the mutual understanding that certain questions were simply never asked. Within this community, it was entirely possible to live for years in the comfortable company of people who knew roughly who you were without anyone ever speaking the fact aloud. It was a community built on collective amnesia, on the decision to erase a shared past and construct a new present that made no reference to what had come before. For Vera Eichmann, this life meant raising 4 sons, since a 4th boy, Ricardo, was born to her and Adolf in 1955, the only one of the Eichmann boys to be born on Argentine soil. It meant keeping house in a succession of increasingly modest properties as the family's financial circumstances fluctuated. It meant navigating the social landscape of the German community with sufficient caution to avoid drawing attention while maintaining the social connections that provided some sense of normalcy. It meant living, day after day, with the knowledge of what her husband had done, of what his true name was, of what would happen if the wrong person discovered it. How much did Vera Eichmann know about the full scope of her husband's crimes? This is a question that historians have never been able to answer with complete certainty. It is clear that she knew he was a wanted man. It is clear that she knew he was living under a false name. It is clear that she participated in the deception required to maintain that false identity. What is less clear is the extent to which she had been made aware, in specific detail, of the operations he had directed, the numbers of people who had been killed as a direct result of his organizational genius. The trials and investigations of the post-war years had produced enormous documentation about the Holocaust, but this documentation was not necessarily accessible to, or sought out by, a woman living in suburban Buenos Aires who had strong personal reasons to avoid contemplating the full truth about the man she had married. And yet, there were signals. The German-language press that circulated within the emigrant community carried news of the Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings. Eichmann's name appeared in these proceedings, and his wife's former life as the wife of an SS Obersturmbannführer who had played a key role in Jewish deportations was not entirely invisible to people who had known the family in Germany or Austria before the war. Within the German community in Argentina, there were people who knew perfectly well who Ricardo Clement really was and who chose to say nothing. That community's silence was one of the most significant aspects of the Eichmann case, because it revealed how thoroughly complicity extended beyond the individual perpetrator to encompass an entire social network that chose collective forgetting over accountability. The years between 1952 and 1960 passed in relative quiet for the Eichmann family in Buenos Aires. The boys grew up. Klaus completed his schooling and began working. Horst and Dieter followed similar trajectories. Little Ricardo, born into an Argentine summer in 1955, was the only one of the brothers who grew up in South America from birth, the only one for whom the German past was a story told by his parents rather than a lived experience. The family moved several times, eventually settling in a modest house on Garibaldi Street in the suburb of San Fernando, a house that Eichmann and his oldest sons built themselves brick by brick over a period of months. The house was unpretentious to the point of austerity, a reflection of the Eichmann family's financial circumstances in these years, since despite his best efforts, Ricardo Clement never managed to achieve more than a modest lower middle-class standard of living in Argentina. It was in this house on Garibaldi Street on the evening of May 11, 1960, that the carefully constructed world of the Clement family came to an abrupt and violent end. The operation that ended it was one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations in the history of the 20th century. And to understand its impact on Eichmann's family, you need to understand how it came to be mounted in the first place. The story of how Eichmann was identified and tracked to Argentina is one that has generated enormous literature, a story involving Nazi hunters, Mossad agents, chance encounters, teenage romance, and the dogged persistence of people who refused to let the Holocaust's administrators simply vanish into comfortable obscurity. The key figure in the initial identification was not, as is sometimes assumed, the famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, though Wiesenthal did play a role in keeping Eichmann's case active when others had given up. The critical breakthrough came from an entirely unexpected direction. In the late 1950s, a blind German-Argentine Jewish man named Lothar Hermann, who lived in the Buenos Aires suburb of Coronel Suarez, discovered that his daughter Sylvia had begun seeing a young man named Klaus Clement. Lothar Hermann had himself been a prisoner in Dachau before the war, had emigrated to Argentina, and had survived the Nazi period by the slimmest of margins. When Sylvia mentioned that Klaus's father had worked for the SS and that the family had lived in Germany, Hermann's suspicions were aroused. He had heard the name Eichmann in the post-war trials coverage. He wrote a letter to Fritz Bauer, the Attorney General of the German state of Hesse, who was one of the few German prosecutors actively pursuing Nazi war criminals with genuine determination. Bauer passed the information to Israel's Mossad intelligence service, which assigned its finest agent, Zvi Aharoni, to the case. Aharoni travelled to Argentina in 1958 and began the painstaking process of confirming whether Ricardo Klement was truly Adolf Eichmann. The confirmation came gradually, through surveillance of the house on Garibaldi Street, through observation of Eichmann himself, through the careful cross-referencing of physical descriptions with known photographs of the former SS officer. By early 1960, the Mossad was certain enough that Mossad director Issa Harel received authorization from Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to mount a capture operation. It was a decision that carried enormous political risk, since Argentina was a sovereign country and the capture of one of its residents by a foreign intelligence service would constitute a serious violation of international law. Ben-Gurion made the decision anyway because he understood something that transcended the niceties of diplomatic protocol. Adolf Eichmann, if left in Argentina, would live out his days in comfortable obscurity. He would die of old age without ever facing justice, and the 6 million people whose deaths he had organized would have no advocate. The capture team, led by the veteran Mossad operations officer Rafi Eitan, arrived in Buenos Aires in stages during late April and early May of 1960. They established safe houses, acquired vehicles, and placed the Garibaldi Street house under intensive surveillance. They watched Eichmann's daily routines for several weeks, observing that he arrived home from work every evening on the same bus, walking the same route from the bus stop to his house. They identified the precise location on the road where he would be most isolated and most vulnerable. And on the evening of May 11th, 1960, a date that happened to fall on the 15th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, they were waiting for him. When Eichmann stepped off the bus that evening and began walking toward his house, an Israeli agent approached him and asked in Spanish if he had a light. Eichmann reached for his cigarettes. In that moment, the team moved. They grabbed him, bundled him into a waiting car, and drove to a safe house in the Buenos Aires suburb of Don Torcuato. Eichmann was calm. He did not resist. When asked if he was Adolf Eichmann, he reportedly paused for a moment and then said, yes. He was Ricardo Klement, but he was also Adolf Eichmann. The two identities, maintained for 15 years with such discipline, collapsed into one in an instant. For the 9 days that followed, while the Israeli team made preparations to fly Eichmann to Israel aboard an El Al plane, carrying the Israeli delegation that had attended Argentina's Independence Day celebrations, Eichmann was held in the safe house. He signed a statement expressing his willingness to stand trial in Israel. The Mossad team flew him out of Buenos Aires on May 20th, 1960, sedated and dressed as an El Al crew member. He arrived in Israel on May 21st, and in the house on Garibaldi Street in San Fernando, Vera Eichmann and her 4 sons waited for a man who would never come home. The announcement that Israel had captured Adolf Eichmann was made by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to the Israeli Knesset on May 23, 1960. The news exploded across the world. Newspapers that had barely thought about Nazi war crimes in years suddenly filled their front pages with the name Eichmann. West Germany was shaken. Argentina protested furiously, calling the operation a flagrant violation of its sovereignty and demanding an apology. The United Nations Security Council debated the matter. Diplomatic cables flew between capitals. And in the suburb of San Fernando in Buenos Aires, Vera Eichmann and her 4 sons were suddenly the most scrutinized family in Argentina. The first days after the announcement were, for the Eichmann family, a period of paralysis and disbelief. Klaus, who was 24 years old at the time, and Horst and Dieter, who were 20 and 18 respectively, had known for years that their father was a wanted man. They had grown up understanding, at least in general terms, that Ricardo Klement was not their father's real name, and that a version of their family's past existed in the world that their parents did not discuss openly. but the knowledge that their father had been specifically seized from the street outside their own house, that he had been drugged and spirited away to Israel aboard a commercial aircraft, and that he was now sitting in a prison cell in a country that was already describing him as one of history's greatest criminals, was something that no amount of mental preparation could have made easy to absorb. Vera Eichmann gave no immediate public statement. She retreated into the house on Garibaldi Street with her sons and said nothing. The Argentine press camped outside. Journalists knocked on the door. Neighbours, many of whom had known perfectly well that Ricardo Clement was not who he claimed to be, suddenly found themselves besieged with questions. They had spent years carefully avoiding. The German community in San Fernando, which had sheltered the Eichmann family's secret for nearly a decade, was confronted with the magnitude of its collective silence. For several weeks, as the international furor over the capture continued and diplomatic negotiations between Israel and Argentina simmered, the Eichmann family was left in a kind of limbo. They had no money beyond what remained in the household account. They had no standing as Argentine citizens, since they had been living under false names. They were the family of a man the whole world now knew as one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, a description that made them objects simultaneously of intense media interest and profound moral opprobrium. And they were navigating this situation without the man who had, for better or worse, been the head of the family, the provider, the presence around whom domestic life had organized itself. The Argentine government, which was furious about the Israeli operation and was in the process of formally protesting it, had no particular interest in persecuting the Eichmann family, who were, after all, victims of the kidnapping in one sense, however complicated the moral dimensions of that victimhood might be. The family was left largely alone by Argentine authorities. They were not deported, they were not prosecuted. They simply had to find a way to continue existing in the country that had sheltered them, now that the reason for that shelter had been brutally removed. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem began on April 11, 1961, and was one of the most significant legal and historical events of the 20th century. It was the first major war crimes trial to be televised, the first in which the individual testimonies of Holocaust survivors were placed at the center of the proceedings, and the first in which the full administrative machinery of the final solution was laid bare in a courtroom before a global audience. Eichmann sat in a bulletproof glass booth in Beit Ham, the House of the People in Jerusalem, listening through headphones to simultaneous translation as the charges against him were read. He was charged on 15 counts, including crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in criminal organizations. His lead defense attorney was a German lawyer named Robert Servatius, who had previously defended defendants at the Nuremberg medical doctors' trial. Servatius mounted a defense based on several arguments: that Eichmann had merely been following orders, that he had not acted out of personal anti-Semitic ideology, but out of professional obligation, that his actions were those of a functionary within a larger bureaucratic system, rather than those of an independent initiator of policy, and that Israel did not have the legitimate jurisdiction to try him for crimes committed outside its territory before it existed as a state. The argument about following orders was particularly contentious, given that the Nuremberg trials had already established the principle that following orders was not an adequate defense for participation in crimes against humanity. The argument about jurisdiction raised genuine legal questions that Israeli and international legal scholars had debated intensely in the months before the trial. Eichmann himself gave extensive testimony over many weeks, speaking in a flat, bureaucratic German that seemed eerily disconnected from the magnitude of what was being described. He denied having had personal authority over the final solution, portraying himself as a subordinate who transmitted orders from above and organized logistics at the direction of his superiors. He insisted that he had never personally killed anyone. He expressed what seemed on the surface like remorse, while simultaneously denying any fundamental guilt for the outcome of the system he had managed. Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial for The New Yorker and whose reports were later published as Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, observed that Eichmann seemed genuinely incapable of understanding that his administrative actions were morally equivalent to the killings themselves, that the man who fills out the deportation orders and the man who operates the gas chamber are co-authors of the same murder. It was a portrait of a particular kind of evil, one that did not announce itself with theatrical villainy, but with the grey procedural efficiency of a competent office manager. The trial lasted from April to August 1961. On December 11, 1961, the three-judge panel presided over by Judge Moshe Landau delivered its verdict. Eichmann was found guilty on all 15 counts. The judges delivered a verdict that carefully and specifically rejected his defense of following orders, establishing that Eichmann had not been a mere functionary but had shown initiative, enthusiasm, and personal investment in the extermination program. The sentence was death. It was the second death sentence ever handed down by an Israeli court, and it would be the only one ever carried out. Eichmann appealed. His appeal was heard by the Israeli Supreme Court, which rejected it in May 1962. He then appealed to the President of Israel, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, for clemency. The appeal for clemency was rejected. Eichmann had exhausted every legal avenue. He met with a German Protestant minister named William Hull in his final days, and those conversations were later published. He wrote a final statement. He requested a bottle of wine, which was granted. He reportedly drank half of it. And in the early hours of June 1, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was hanged at Ramla prison in Israel. He was 56 years old, his body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean Sea beyond Israeli territorial waters so that no grave marker could ever become a site of Nazi pilgrimage or memorial. The news of the execution reached Vera Eichmann and her sons in Buenos Aires. How they received it, what they said to each other in those first moments, is not part of the public record. We know only that the execution marked the definitive end of one chapter of the Eichmann family story and the beginning of another one, the chapter in which they would each, individually and in their own way, have to decide what their father's name meant to them and what kind of relationship they would have, publicly and privately, with the legacy of the man who had built their family and destroyed so many others. Vera Eichmann, who was 53 years old when her husband was executed, chose a path of private endurance rather than public engagement. She remained in Argentina. She did not return to Austria or Germany. She did not give press interviews. She did not make public statements. She lived quietly in Buenos Aires, maintained a low profile within the German community, and raised the youngest of her sons, 8-year-old Ricardo, in the aftermath of a catastrophe that had reshaped everything. She was, by all accounts, a deeply private woman who found the public scrutiny of the trial and its aftermath profoundly alien to her nature, and who dealt with it by simply withdrawing from anything that might bring her into contact with journalists, cameras, or questions about her husband. But what did Vera Eichmann actually think and feel about the man she had married? Did she believe he was guilty of what the Jerusalem court had found him guilty of? Did she condemn his actions? Did she mourn him? Did she feel shame? The answers to these questions are necessarily incomplete because Vera Eichmann was extraordinarily careful about what she said publicly, and the few glimpses we have of her private views come filtered through the accounts of journalists and researchers who managed, on rare occasions, to get close enough to observe her. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Vera Eichmann never publicly condemned her husband. She never expressed remorse on his behalf. She never publicly acknowledged the legitimacy of the charges against him or the justice of the verdict. She maintained in the few statements she did make over the following decades a posture of loyalty to the man she had married, a loyalty that critics understandably found deeply troubling given what she was being loyal to. But that represented, on some level, the irreducible human reality of a woman whose identity had been constructed entirely around her role as the wife of Adolf Eichmann. In the years following the execution, various journalists and researchers who attempted to speak with Vera reported that she could seem, in private conversation, quite ordinary. A German-speaking grandmother in Buenos Aires who kept her house neat, enjoyed her grandchildren, and spoke of her husband with affection rather than shame. One reporter who managed a brief encounter in the late 1960s described her as speaking of Adolf as though describing a misunderstood man who had been the victim of a political persecution without any acknowledgement of the millions who had been his actual victims. This is perhaps not surprising, given that the alternative, the full acknowledgement of what her husband had done, would have required her to confront not only his guilt, but her own 40-year investment in his life, her own silence, her own accommodation of his lies. Human beings are, as a general rule, extraordinarily resistant to the kind of retrospective self-reconstruction that complete honesty about such a situation would require. What is documented is that Vera Eichmann lived in Buenos Aires for the rest of her life, never returning to her native Austria, never seeking public rehabilitation or vindication. She died in Buenos Aires on July 6, 2004, at the age of 95, outliving her husband by more than 4 decades. She was buried without fanfare in Argentina. No major obituaries appeared. The world barely noticed. The woman who had been the wife of Adolf Eichmann slipped out of it as quietly as she had tried to live in it during her long widowhood, without confession, without explanation, without apology. But if Vera Eichmann's silence in the face of her husband's legacy was profound and troubling, it was nothing compared to the storm that her eldest son, Klaus, would generate in the years following the execution. Klaus Eichmann was 26 years old when his father was hanged. He had grown up in Germany during the Nazi years, had crossed the Atlantic as a teenager, had spent his young adulthood in the Argentine suburbs under a false name, and had watched the trial of the century that defined his family name. His reaction to all of this was, to say the least, not what anyone hoping for generational accountability might have wished for. In 1966, 4 years after the execution, Klaus Eichmann gave an interview to the German Illustrated magazine. Quick that caused an international uproar. The interview was extensive and was remarkable for the combination of defiance, bitterness, and thinly veiled threat that characterized Klaus's responses. He spoke of his desire for revenge against the men who had helped bring his father to justice. He referred to Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, in terms that amounted to an open threat. He expressed anger at Fritz Bauer, the German attorney general who had passed Eichmann's location to the Israelis. He described his father not as a criminal, but as a man who had been hounded and murdered by his enemies. He showed no sign of having reckoned, in any serious way, with the question of what his father had actually done: the systematic murder of 6 million people. Instead, he framed the entire affair in terms of personal grievance and family honor, portraying himself as the wronged son of a wronged man, rather than as the son of one of history's most consequential criminals. The 1966 interview was not an isolated moment of youthful anger. It was a considered statement given to a major German publication that revealed Klaus Eichmann's settled view of his father's legacy. He believed his father had been the victim of a uniquely unjust targeting, that Israel had no right to try him, and that the men who had made the trial possible had committed a greater wrong than anything Eichmann himself had done. It was, to anyone outside the circle of the Eichmann family and their most sympathetic acquaintances, a morally staggering position to hold. And yet, considered in the context of everything Klaus had experienced, from his childhood under a false name to the years of watching his father live in permanent fear of discovery, to the spectacle of the trial itself, it is perhaps not difficult to understand, however impossible it is to excuse. What the interview also revealed was something about the particular psychological burden placed on the children of perpetrators, the second generation of those who committed the Holocaust's crimes. Klaus Eichmann had grown up in a household where the true nature of his father's work was never directly confronted. He had been raised to see his father as a loyal soldier and a dutiful servant of his nation, not as the organizer of mass deportation and death. The revelation of what his father had actually done, which came to its fullest and most terrible expression in the Jerusalem trial, forced Klaus into a choice that was, for him, psychologically almost impossible. He could either accept the truth and rebuild his entire sense of self and family on a foundation of horror and shame, or he could deny it, defend his father, and maintain the version of family loyalty that his upbringing had instilled. He chose defense, and that choice would shape the rest of his public life. Following the quick interview, Klaus Eichmann retreated from public view. He had attracted enormous negative attention with his statements, and the practical risks of being so publicly associated with the defense of Adolf Eichmann in the late 1960s, a period when West Germany was going through a period of intense social reckoning with the Nazi past, were considerable. He continued to live in Argentina, where he worked in various capacities and maintained a private life that he guarded with considerable determination from journalistic inquiry. Over the following decades, there were occasional reports of his whereabouts and circumstances, but for the most part, Klaus Eichmann became one of the most reclusive of all the children of major Nazi perpetrators, a man who had said his piece in 1966 and then decided that further public engagement held nothing for him. There were periodic reports that Klaus Eichmann, like his brother Horst, continued to live in Argentina, and that both brothers had families of their own, which meant that Adolf Eichmann's grandchildren were growing up in Buenos Aires, carrying a name that the world had long associated with the worst of human history. Whether and how those grandchildren were told about their grandfather, what framework they were given for understanding who he was and what he had done, is not something that has entered the public record. But the question of how the Eichmann legacy filtered through subsequent generations is one that sits at the heart of the broader questions raised by all the families of perpetrators. Questions about whether guilt is inheritable, about what children and grandchildren owe to the victims of their ancestors, and about whether the silence of complicity can ever be cleanly distinguished from the silence of overwhelmed private grief. The second Eichmann son, Horst, has maintained an even deeper public silence than his older brother. Born in 1940, Horst Eichmann grew up in Germany during the war years and was in his early teens when the family joined their father in Argentina. He was old enough to have some memories of the German period, young enough to have constructed his adult identity almost entirely within the Argentine context. In the years following the trial and execution, Horst appears to have made a deliberate decision to minimize his public presence to the greatest possible extent. There are virtually no documented interviews, no public statements, no engagement with the questions raised by his father's trial. He remained in Argentina, kept a low profile, and apparently devoted himself to private life in the most complete way available to him. The silence of Horst Eichmann is, in its own way, as significant as the vocal defense mounted by Klaus. Both responses, the defiant public statement and the absolute withdrawal from any public engagement, represent ways of dealing with the same underlying impossibility, the impossibility of being the son of Adolf Eichmann in the world that his trial created, a world in which that name had become synonymous not just with historical villainy, but with the specific, bureaucratic machinery of industrial murder, with the reduction of millions of human beings to entries on a deportation manifest. There is no script available for navigating that situation. There is no established protocol for responding to the journalist who knocks on your door and asks how you feel about being the son of the man who organized the transport of the Jews of Hungary to Auschwitz. You can speak, as Klaus did, in defiance. You can remain silent, as Horst did, or you can do something more radical and more difficult, which is to engage honestly with the truth and try to find a way to live with it. That third path was the one eventually taken by the youngest of the Eichmann sons, Ricardo, and it is a path that stands in the starkest possible contrast to the choices made by his older brothers. But before we come to Ricardo Eichmann's remarkable story, we need to spend more time with the third son, Dieter, whose path through the consequences of his father's legacy represents yet another variation on the impossible themes that all four brothers were forced to navigate. Dieter Eichmann was born in 1942, the same year that the deportation machinery his father ran was reaching its fullest and most terrible efficiency. He was 3 years old when the war ended, 5 when the family began its life in hiding in Austria, and 10 when they joined his father in Argentina. Like his brothers, he grew up knowing that the family name was dangerous, that Ricardo Clement was a fiction, that the comfortable suburban life of San Fernando existed at the pleasure of a secret that could unravel at any moment. He was 18 years old when that secret unraveled. Dieter Eichmann's response to the trial and its aftermath was in some ways the least legible of all the brothers' responses from the outside. He did not give interviews. He did not make public statements of the aggressive kind that Klaus had made. He did not withdraw entirely from all human contact with the public world as Horst appeared to do. He simply continued to live in Argentina, apparently working, apparently raising a family, apparently negotiating the weight of his father's name in the private spaces of his own life, without bringing that negotiation into any publicly accessible form. The question of what Dieter Eichmann believed about his father, what he told his own children, how he framed the history of his family within the narrative of his own life, belongs entirely to the private domain that he maintained with considerable determination. There is another dimension of the trial that deserves particular attention in the context of the Eichmann family story, which is the extraordinary testimony given by Holocaust survivors over the weeks of the Jerusalem proceedings. The trial of Adolf Eichmann was the first major public proceeding in which survivors were allowed to testify at length, not merely about specific facts relevant to the charges, but about their full experience of the Holocaust, the details of what had been done to them and to their families and to their communities, the texture of what it had meant to be caught in the machine that Eichmann had helped to build and run. More than 100 survivors testified. Their accounts were broadcast on radio and televised, reaching audiences around the world who had not, until that moment, heard the human reality of the Holocaust described in such sustained, specific, personal detail. The effect of this testimony on public understanding of the Holocaust was profound. It transformed the abstract knowledge that millions of people had been murdered into the lived experience of specific individuals who had watched their parents and children and siblings and neighbours disappear into transports and camps and gas chambers. It gave faces and voices to numbers that had previously existed, primarily as statistics. And it placed the bureaucratic machinery that Eichmann had administered into direct and visceral relationship with the human beings who had been processed through that machinery, the people who had been reduced in Eichmann's organizational calculations to entries on a deportation manifest, and who were now standing in a Jerusalem courtroom and insisting on their full humanity in the face of the man who had tried to organize their extinction. How did the Eichmann family in Buenos Aires follow the trial? Were they listening to the radio broadcasts? Were they reading the newspaper coverage? Were they watching whatever television coverage was available to them in Argentina? The historical record does not give us a complete picture of the family's engagement with the trial proceedings from a distance of 12,000 kilometers, but it is inconceivable that they were unaware of the major developments. The trial was front-page news in every major newspaper in Argentina throughout its duration. The German-language press of the Buenos Aires German community covered it extensively. Klaus, Horst and Dieter were adults, 25, 21 and 19 years old respectively when the trial began. Old enough to follow and comprehend the proceedings in detail if they chose to do so. What was it like to hear Holocaust survivors describe their experiences in a context that connected those experiences directly to the specific administrative decisions and organizational choices of your father? What was it like to hear witnesses describe arriving at a railway station and being directed by uniformed officers operating under a system whose logistics your father had coordinated toward a line that led to survival or toward a line that led to death? These are questions for which no answer exists in any public record. They are questions about an interior experience that none of the Eichmann sons have ever publicly described in any detail. But they are questions that matter, because the answers, whatever they were, shaped the choices that Klaus and his brothers subsequently made about how to respond to their father's legacy. The prosecution's final address at the Eichmann trial was delivered by Attorney General Gideon Hausner, whose opening statement had begun with the famous phrase, "When I stand before you here, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I am not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers." Hausner's closing argument built systematically on the evidence presented throughout the trial to establish beyond reasonable doubt that Eichmann had been not a subordinate functionary, but a central and enthusiastic architect of the final solution, a man who had gone beyond his orders on multiple occasions to press for more aggressive deportation policies, to resist efforts to save Jews through ransom arrangements, and to ensure that the extermination program continued even as the military situation deteriorated and other senior officials were beginning to seek exit strategies. The picture that Hausner painted was of a man who had found in the final solution not merely a career opportunity, but something approaching a personal vocation, who had invested himself in the extermination of European Jewry with an intensity that transcended mere bureaucratic compliance. The defense, for its part, presented a different Eichmann entirely. Servatius argued that his client had been a low-level bureaucrat trapped in a totalitarian system, that he had lacked the authority to deviate from orders handed down from above, that the ultimate responsibility for the final solution lay with Hitler and Himmler and the other senior figures of the Nazi hierarchy, most of whom were already dead and beyond the reach of any court. This argument was not entirely without historical substance, in that the Nazi system was indeed characterized by a complex hierarchy of command, and that Eichmann did operate within that hierarchy rather than outside it. But it failed both legally and morally because it did not account for the evidence of Eichmann's personal initiative and enthusiasm, for the Sassen tapes in which he had boasted of his role, for the testimony of survivors who had encountered him personally and who described a man who bore no resemblance to the anxious subordinate presented by the defense. The verdict, when it came in December 1961, was unambiguous. All 15 counts, guilty on all of them. The three judges, in their written opinion, rejected every significant argument of the defense and established with careful legal reasoning that Eichmann had been a principal in the crimes charged, not a secondary actor, not a man merely following orders, but a man who had made choices, exercised initiative, and invested his professional competence in the service of genocide. It was one of the most thorough and legally sophisticated verdicts in the history of international criminal law, and it remains, 60 years later, a document of extraordinary historical and legal significance. For the Eichmann family, the verdict was the moment when the legal system of a sovereign state formally and finally declared their husband and father to be one of history's greatest criminals, a man whose crimes were among the worst that human beings had ever committed against each other. However prepared they might have been for this outcome, however much they might have told themselves and each other that the verdict was politically motivated, that the trial was a show trial, that Israel had no legitimate authority to judge a German citizen for acts committed in Europe before Israel existed, the reality of the verdict was something they had to live with. The world had spoken. The most thorough judicial proceeding in the history of crimes against the Jewish people had concluded. And the conclusion was Adolf Eichmann's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. In the years following the execution, the question of how the Eichmann case and the broader context of post-war Nazi justice affected the lives of ordinary German and Austrian citizens, and not just the immediate families of convicted perpetrators, became an increasingly important subject for historians and social scientists. The generation that had lived through the Nazi period was aging. Their children were asking questions. The process of reckoning with the past, known in German as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, literally the overcoming of the past, was becoming a central preoccupation of West German intellectual and political life. Authors like Günter Grass and Heinrich Böll were writing novels that grappled with the question of collective guilt and collective responsibility. Historians were producing increasingly detailed accounts of the Nazi period and its crimes. Teachers were beginning, hesitantly and unevenly, to address the Holocaust in classrooms. The post-war silence was breaking, slowly and imperfectly, into speech. Within this broader German cultural context, the Eichmann trial and the subsequent execution served as one of the most important catalysts. The trial's global reach, its televised testimony, and the detailed documentation it produced of how the final solution had been organized and implemented made it impossible for anyone paying attention to the German-language media of the early 1960s to maintain complete ignorance of what had happened in the Nazi years. And the figure of Eichmann, sitting in his glass booth in Jerusalem, was a figure that specifically implicated the German bureaucratic apparatus, the German railway system, the German civil service. His crimes were not the crimes of SS thugs operating in concentration camps, visible and obviously brutal. His crimes were the crimes of an office, a filing system, a set of administrative procedures. They were crimes committed by a kind of person who could be found in any bureaucracy, in any country, in any era. This made them, paradoxically, more disturbing than the crimes of obvious monsters because they implicated the ordinary structures of organized society in the production of mass murder. It was against this background that Klaus Eichmann's 1966 interview in Quick magazine landed with such particular force. The interview came at a moment when West Germany was in the early stages of a generational reckoning with the Nazi past, when the children of the perpetrator generation were beginning to ask the questions that their parents had refused to answer, when the cultural and political pressure to confront rather than suppress the history of the Third Reich was growing. Into this context, Klaus Eichmann injected a voice of naked defiance, a voice that said, in effect, "My father was not a criminal. The men who brought him to justice were criminals, and I want revenge." It was a statement that managed to be simultaneously understandable in purely personal terms and morally catastrophic in its implications. It was also, for West Germany in 1966, a deeply unwelcome reminder that the second generation of Nazi perpetrator families was not uniformly engaged in the process of honest reckoning that the broader culture was beginning to demand. The contrast between Klaus Eichmann's 1966 interview and the response of other children of perpetrators who were, in those same years, beginning to speak publicly about their father's crimes in very different terms was stark and significant. Nicholas Frank, whose father Hans Frank had been the Governor-General of occupied Poland and one of the defendants at Nuremberg, was developing the intense and publicly expressed condemnation of his father's legacy that would eventually result in his books and his decades of public speaking on the subject. Albert Speer Jr., son of Hitler's architect, was pursuing a career in architecture while maintaining a careful distance from his father's specific associations with the Nazi elite. These different responses across the children of perpetrators mapped the terrain of what was possible in terms of how one could live with the inheritance of such a history. The question of whether Klaus Eichmann ever revised his views in the decades after the 1966 interview is one that the historical record cannot definitively answer, because Klaus never again made himself publicly available in the same way. There were occasional sightings by journalists who tracked him down in Buenos Aires, occasional reports of his circumstances, but no sustained public engagement, no interviews comparable to the Quick magazine piece, no books or public statements that would allow us to trace any evolution in his thinking. He retreated into private life, and private life swallowed whatever ongoing reckoning he may or may not have conducted with himself about his father's crimes, and his own 1966 decision to defend the indefensible in a major European publication. The psychological literature on children of perpetrators, which has grown substantially since the 1970s, when therapists and researchers began systematically studying the second generation of the Nazi perpetrator class, suggests that the patterns exhibited by Klaus, Horst, Dieter, and Ricardo Eichmann are not unusual among their generation of perpetrator children. The combination of public defensiveness and private silence that characterized Klaus and his brothers' approach to their father's legacy has been documented in numerous other families. The extreme rarity of the Nicholas Frank pattern of active public denunciation suggests that confrontational honesty about a perpetrator parent's crimes requires a particular combination of personal courage, psychological resilience, and perhaps a certain distance, emotional or relational, from the parent in question. Nicholas Frank has spoken of having felt little affection for his father, which may have made it easier for him to condemn him publicly. The Eichmann sons, by all accounts, had a warmer relationship with their father, experienced him as a loving and attentive parent, and carried the specific difficulty of condemning a man who had also been kind to them in ways that the children of his victims could never have imagined. This is the unbearable paradox at the heart of the Eichmann family story, that a man can organize the murder of 6 million people and still be, to his own children, a kind and loving father. That the capacity for atrocity and the capacity for domestic tenderness can coexist in the same human being, drawing on different reservoirs of personality and directed toward entirely different objects, so that the man who comes home to read bedtime stories to his boys is in some sense genuinely a different man from the one who sits in his office coordinating deportation manifests. Not a different moral agent, not excused by the kindness he shows at home, but genuinely a complex human being, rather than a two-dimensional monster, which is exactly what makes him so much more frightening than a two-dimensional monster would be, and exactly what makes the burden he left his children so much heavier than the burden left by perpetrators who were also, in their private lives, demonstrably cruel and loveless. We should also consider what the Eichmann case reveals about the limitations of justice as a response to crimes of this scale. Eichmann was captured, tried, convicted, and executed. By any measure, this represents a more complete application of judicial process to a major Holocaust perpetrator than was achieved in many other cases. And yet, the execution of one man, however guilty, however central to the organizational machinery of genocide, cannot undo what he did. It cannot restore the 6 million people who were killed. It cannot give back the years stolen from the survivors who gave testimony in Jerusalem. It cannot heal the wounds carried by the communities that were destroyed. It provides, at most, a formal acknowledgement by the State of Israel and by history itself that what was done was criminal, and that criminal actions have consequences for those who commit them. This acknowledgement matters enormously. It is far better than impunity. But it is not and can never be equivalent to justice in any full sense, because justice of that kind is not available for crimes of this magnitude. For the Eichmann family, The execution meant the permanent closure of any possibility of resolution between them and their father. Klaus and his brothers would never be able to sit across from Adolf Eichmann in a prison visiting room and ask him the questions that children of perpetrators have needed to ask across generations. Did you know what you were doing was wrong? Did you feel anything? Did you ever think about us, about the lives we would have to lead bearing your name? How do we explain you to our own children? These questions went unanswered, swallowed by the sea along with the ashes of the man who alone could have provided the answers. And so the Eichmann sons were left to construct their own understanding of their father from the external record, from the trial transcripts and the Sasson tapes and the historical scholarship, just as everyone else in the world was constructing their understanding, with the single difference that for them it was also personal. What the stories of Klaus, Horst and Dieter Eichmann reveal, taken together, is the extraordinary range of ways in which the children of perpetrators attempted to handle a burden that no child had asked for and that no social or psychological framework had been designed to help them carry. The 20th century created, through the Holocaust and the trials that followed it, an entirely new category of moral dilemma. The question of what the children of mass murderers owe to the world that their parents helped destroy, and what the world owes to them. The Nazi perpetrator generation was the first in history to be held legally accountable for crimes of such scale and specificity, which meant that their children were also the first generation of people who had to navigate the specific shame of that accountability, not as a vague ancestral guilt, but as a present and pressing reality, defined by courtrooms and public verdicts, and the daily question of what to do with a surname that the world associated with atrocity. Different families dealt with this differently. The children of Rudolf Hess, particularly his son Wolf, became public defenders of their father's reputation, spending decades arguing that he had been wrongly imprisoned and unfairly characterized. The daughter of Heinrich Himmler, Gudrun, became a supporter of the Stille Hilfe organization, which provided assistance to convicted and fugitive SS members, maintaining to her dying day in 2018 her conviction that her father had been a good man. The son of Hans Frank, Niklas, went to the opposite extreme, becoming one of the most vocal and passionate public denouncers of his own father's legacy, writing books and giving speeches that condemned Hans Frank in the harshest possible terms, driven by a conviction that honest confrontation with the truth was the only morally acceptable response. These different paths, defense, silence, and confrontation, represent the spectrum of choices available to the children of the perpetrators, and the Eichmann brothers landed at different points along that spectrum. The figure who ultimately provided the most publicly visible and historically interesting response to the Eichmann legacy was the youngest of the four brothers, Ricardo Eichmann. Born in Buenos Aires on March 12, 1955, Ricardo was the only one of Eichmann's sons who had no personal experience of Germany or of the Nazi period. He was the product entirely of the Argentine chapter of the family story, a child of San Fernando who grew up speaking Spanish as naturally as German, and who had no direct memories of a European past. When the Mossad came for his father in May 1960, Ricardo was 5 years old. He was too young to understand what was happening, too young to have formed any stable sense of who his father was or what his father had done. He grew up knowing his father's story only through the lens of what he was told by his mother and brothers, through the coverage of the trial that he eventually encountered as he aged into comprehension, and through the records and testimonies that the trial had placed in the permanent historical archive. Ricardo's childhood and adolescence after his father's execution were spent in Buenos Aires, surrounded by the tight community of German-speaking emigrant families who had built their lives in the northern suburbs of the city. He attended school in Argentina, formed Argentine friendships and cultural attachments, and grew up in a household that, following the execution of his father, was shaped almost entirely by his mother's determination to maintain a quiet, private existence. He was 12 years old when his brother Klaus gave the notorious Quick magazine interview in 1966, old enough to understand that Klaus's public defiance had brought renewed scrutiny and negative attention to the family, perhaps not yet old enough to fully understand why the world was so horrified by what Klaus had said. As Ricardo moved through his teenage years and into young adulthood, he made a series of choices that would lead him in a dramatically different direction from his brothers. Where Klaus had stayed in Argentina and made his brief, explosive intervention in public debate before retreating, and where Horst and Dieter had essentially defined themselves by their absence from any public discussion, Ricardo chose education and, ultimately, a public professional life in a field that was about as far removed from the dark business of his father's legacy as it was possible to get. Ricardo Eichmann became an archaeologist. The choice of archaeology as a career is not, in the context of Ricardo's biography, an accident or an irrelevance. Archaeology is, at its core, the study of the deep past of civilizations and cultures that predate living memory, of the physical remnants left by people whose relationship to the present is mediated entirely through objects and structures and inscriptions, rather than through living testimony. It is a discipline that requires a particular kind of attention to the long arc of human history, an ability to situate the present moment within a much longer story. For a man who was burdened with the specific and terrible history of his own family name, the appeal of a profession that dealt with a past that was both more ancient and more universal than his own family's crimes seems not difficult to understand. It was a way of being a scholar of human history without being imprisoned by his particular corner of it. Ricardo Eichmann pursued his academic training with determination and eventually achieved considerable professional distinction. He became affiliated with the German Archaeological Institute, one of the world's most prestigious archaeological research organizations, and built a career that took him across the Middle East, working on excavations and research projects in Turkey, Yemen, and other regions. He became a specialist in the archaeology of ancient cultures, publishing academic work that had nothing whatsoever to do with the 20th century or with his family name. He was, in his professional life, simply a German archaeologist of significant accomplishment, a person who had built an identity in which the name Eichmann referred to a scholar rather than to a mass murderer. But Ricardo Eichmann never entirely escaped the questions that his family name raised. As his professional profile grew, the gap between his academic achievements and his father's historical identity became an object of curiosity for journalists and researchers who found in that gap something both remarkable and troubling. How does a man build a scholarly life in Germany of all places when his surname is Eichmann? How does he negotiate his professional identity with colleagues who are aware of his parentage? How does he discuss his father's crimes with the Holocaust survivors and their descendants who are present in the German cultural and intellectual landscape in which he has chosen to work? In 2010, Ricardo Eichmann gave an interview to the German news magazine Der Spiegel that represented the most direct and substantial public engagement with his father's legacy that any of the four Eichmann brothers had ever offered. The interview was remarkable for several reasons. First, because Ricardo chose to give it at all, breaking with the pattern of public silence that had characterized most of his brothers' approach to the subject. Second, because of what he said in it, which was both more honest and more emotionally complex than anything that had previously emerged from the family. In the Der Spiegel interview, Ricardo Eichmann spoke of the particular difficulty of being the son of a man whose crimes had made the family name a symbol of the Holocaust itself. He described the experience of growing up in Buenos Aires in the shadow of the trial and execution, of navigating a childhood defined by something that had happened before his own consciousness had formed, of carrying a name that had been turned into a historical noun. He spoke of the ways in which his father's crimes had shaped his own life in ways both visible and invisible, both professional and personal. He didn't defend his father. He did not adopt the posture of denial and defiance that Klaus had struck in 1966. He acknowledged the crimes. He acknowledged the scale of the suffering his father had caused, and he spoke of the complex and unresolvable difficulty of trying to separate his own identity from a name that carried such weight. What Ricardo Eichmann did not do, and this was perhaps the most significant thing about the interview, was adopt a posture of public self-flagellation or performed remorse. He was not Nicholas Frank, who had made the denunciation of his father the central project of his public life and who used every available platform to condemn Hans Frank in the strongest possible terms. Ricardo was something more private and more complicated than that. A man who had processed his father's legacy in his own interior space and who was willing to share something of that processing without either defending the indefensible or constructing a public identity around his family's shame. He seemed in the interview like someone who had genuinely grappled with the question of what it means to be the son of Adolf Eichmann, who had not resolved it to any comfortable conclusion and who was willing to say so. The 2010 interview raised the question of whether Ricardo had ever felt the impulse to change his name, to sever the public connection between himself and his father by adopting a different surname. This is a question that has been asked of many children of prominent Nazi perpetrators, and the answers have been widely varied. Some, like the descendants of Hermann Göring, have chosen name changes as a way of creating distance between their professional and personal lives and their ancestral shame. Others have explicitly refused, arguing that changing their name would represent a denial of responsibility, and that carrying the name publicly is itself a form of accountability. Ricardo Eichmann appears to have chosen to keep his name, to publish his academic work under the name Eichmann, to be known professionally as Ricardo Eichmann. It is a choice that must require, every time he publishes an article, or gives a lecture, or introduces himself to a new colleague, a kind of courage that most people will never be called upon to demonstrate. The professional context in which Ricardo Eichmann built his career also raises its own particular ironies and difficulties. The German Archaeological Institute, where he worked for many years, is an institution funded by the German government and deeply embedded in the broader German scholarly and cultural landscape, a landscape that has spent the decades since 1945 engaged in one of the most sustained and serious national efforts at historical reckoning in human history. Germany's engagement with the Holocaust through its educational system, its memorial culture, its legal prosecutions, and its public discourse is in many ways an extraordinary achievement, a national community's effort to look honestly at the worst thing it has ever done and to refuse the temptations of minimization and denial. Working within that German institutional and cultural landscape as a man named Eichmann must require, every day, a particular kind of negotiation that most of his colleagues would never fully understand. There is another dimension to the story of Ricardo Eichmann and his father's legacy that is worth examining, which is the question of how the broader German and Argentine communities responded to the presence of Eichmann's family in their midst. In Argentina, the German-speaking community of Buenos Aires had, as we have seen, sheltered the Eichmann family's secret for nearly a decade before the Mossad operation exposed it. That community's response to the exposure was complex. There was embarrassment. There was defensiveness. There were individuals who had genuinely not known who Ricardo Clement really was, and individuals who had known perfectly well and chosen comfortable ignorance. There were people who felt that the Israeli operation, regardless of who it had targeted, represented a violation of Argentine sovereignty that deserved condemnation, and people who felt that the capture of Adolf Eichmann was a triumph of justice that they could not bring themselves to be entirely unhappy about, even while deploring the means by which it had been accomplished. For the Eichmann family within this community, the exposure of their father's true identity created an immediate and a permanent transformation in their social landscape. People who had been neighbours and acquaintances in the easy, unquestioning way of suburban community life were suddenly people who had known, or chosen not to know, something enormous and terrible. The shared fiction of the Clement family was gone. What remained was the reality of the Eichmann family, living in the same houses in the same suburbs, their true name now public knowledge, their father's face on newspaper front pages around the world. The question of whether the Eichmann sons ever considered leaving Argentina is an interesting one. For Klaus, Horst and Dieter, Argentina appears to have remained home throughout their adult lives. They had grown up there, had built their adult identities there, and had their own families there. Whatever social difficulties came with bearing the Eichmann name in the post-trial world of Buenos Aires, those difficulties were presumably navigable within the specific social environment they had known all their lives. Leaving would have meant starting over in a country where their father's name might be even more prominent in public consciousness, since Germany and Austria had been engaged in far more intensive processes of public historical reckoning with the Nazi period than Argentina had. Ricardo's departure from Argentina to pursue his academic career in Germany is thus the more remarkable of the two options, because it represented a voluntary entry into the society that his father's crimes had most deeply wounded, the German-speaking world that bore the primary historical responsibility for the Holocaust, and that had, in the post-war decades, constructed its entire political and cultural identity around the acknowledgement of that responsibility. That Ricardo Eichmann chose to build his life and career in that world, in Germany, in the German scholarly establishment carrying the name Eichmann, is a biographical fact that requires considerable reflection to fully absorb. We should also consider the broader context of what happened to the network of people who had helped the Eichmann family maintain their secret in Argentina. The Argentine German community that had sheltered them was, in the aftermath of the 1960 capture, suddenly subject to a level of international scrutiny that it had never previously experienced. Questions about who had known, who had helped, and who had provided the material and social support that allowed Eichmann to live relatively comfortably in Argentina for a decade were asked by journalists, by intelligence services, and by historians who were beginning to construct a comprehensive picture of the post-war Nazi escape networks. What emerged from this scrutiny was a portrait of a community that had operated on a principle of deliberate collective amnesia, in which the pressure not to ask certain questions, not to connect certain names with certain histories, not to disturb the comfortable fiction of a new beginning in South America had been powerful enough to keep even people who privately knew the truth from saying anything that might disturb the social peace. This is not an excuse for that silence. The silence of Eichmann's neighbours and community acquaintances in Buenos Aires was, in its way, a continuation of the same moral failure that had allowed the Holocaust to proceed. The failure of ordinary people to say no to an arrangement that they knew, on some level, was deeply wrong. The scale was obviously incomparably different, but the mechanism, the prioritisation of social comfort over moral truth, was the same. There were individuals within the Argentine German community who had played more active roles in Eichmann's life there than mere passive neighbours. Willem Sassen, a Dutch SS veteran who had also fled to Argentina after the war, was one of the more remarkable figures in this category. Between 1956 and 1960, Sassen had conducted extensive recorded conversations with Eichmann in which Eichmann spoke with extraordinary frankness about his role in the Holocaust, often going far beyond the picture of a mere functionary following orders that he would later present at his Jerusalem trial. In these recordings, Eichmann boasted of his central role, expressed satisfaction with his work, and demonstrated a degree of ideological anti-Semitism and personal investment in the final solution that his trial testimony carefully minimized. Sassen had hoped to sell edited versions of these conversations to illustrated magazines, and fragments did appear in Life magazine in 1960 following the capture. The full recordings, known as the Sassen tapes, eventually became one of the most important documentary records of Eichmann's true culpability. The existence of the Sassen conversations reveals something important about the Buenos Aires world that Eichmann had inhabited, which is that it was not simply a community of people keeping a difficult secret in silence. It was also, in some cases, a community in which former Nazis discussed their wartime activities with each other with a degree of openness that would have been unimaginable in a context where actual accountability was a realistic possibility. Eichmann had spoken of the final solution to Sassen not reluctantly or defensively, but with something that resembled pride. The pride of a professional man discussing a difficult project that he felt he had handled skillfully. This was the real Eichmann, or at least one dimension of him, the man who existed in the privacy of a community of people who shared his history and his immunity from justice. What did Eichmann's sons know about the Sassen conversations? There is no definitive answer to this question. Klaus was 20 when the conversations were taking place, old enough to have been aware of at least some of what his father was doing, though the conversations were private and Eichmann was not in the habit of including his children in his discussions with community members. Ricardo was too young to have known anything at the time. The other brothers fall somewhere between. What we can say is that when the Sassen tapes became public knowledge following the capture, the image they presented of Adolf Eichmann as a man who hadn't merely followed orders but who had embraced his role with personal conviction was deeply damaging to any argument that he had been a bureaucrat swept along by forces beyond his control. And that image was now also, inevitably, the inheritance of his sons. The legal proceedings around the Eichmann case also had implications for the family that extended beyond the execution itself. Questions were raised in various jurisdictions about whether other members of the Eichmann family, including his brother Friedrich Karl, should face legal scrutiny for their own wartime activities. And this brings us to another figure who is often overlooked in discussions of the Eichmann case, but who played an important role in both the wartime story and in the post-war escape. Friedrich Karl Eichmann, born in 1909, was Adolf's younger brother by 3 years. Like Adolf, Friedrich Karl had been involved in the SS during the war, though at a considerably less senior level than his brother. More significantly, Friedrich Karl had emigrated to Argentina before Adolf did, establishing himself in Buenos Aires in the years immediately after the war. It was Friedrich Karl who provided Adolf with the initial contacts and network support that allowed him to establish himself in Argentina when he arrived in 1950. He was, in this sense, a key facilitator of his brother's decade of freedom in South America. Friedrich Karl Eichmann's own wartime activities were investigated to varying degrees by post-war authorities, but he was never brought to trial in the way that Adolf was. He lived in Argentina for the rest of his life, working in business and maintaining a lower profile than his brother ever could in the aftermath of the 1960 capture. He died in Buenos Aires in 1987, having never faced legal accountability for whatever role he had played in the wartime system, though the exact nature and extent of his personal involvement in Nazi crimes has been the subject of historical debate. His presence in Argentina and his role in facilitating his brother's escape and resettlement there is a reminder that the Eichmann case was not just the story of one man in isolation, but of a network of family and community connections that stretched across continents and sustained the escape of perpetrators from justice across a generation. The broader question raised by Friedrich Karl's story is one that applies to the entire network of people who helped former Nazis escape and rebuild their lives after the war. To what extent does facilitating a criminal's escape from justice make one morally and legally complicit in the ongoing harm caused by that escape? In Eichmann's case, the harm of his escape from justice was not that he continued to commit crimes in Argentina, because he did not. It was that he lived comfortably for 15 years without facing any of the accountability that his victims and their families deserved. Every year that he spent in Buenos Aires as Ricardo Clement was a year in which justice was denied, in which the historical record was allowed to exist without the formal acknowledgement of culpability that a trial provides. The people who helped him escape and stay escaped were participants in that denial of justice, even if they personally committed no further crimes. Now, there is another aspect of the Eichmann family story that deserves our attention, which is the question of the broader context of Nazi families in Argentina and how the Eichmann case fits into a larger picture of post-war escapes and their long-term consequences for the communities that hosted the escapees. Argentina was not the only country that took in former Nazi officials and their families, but it was the most significant, and the community of German emigrants that built itself in Buenos Aires in the post-war years was large enough and self-contained enough to constitute something like a small society unto itself, with its own internal hierarchies, loyalties, tensions, and unspoken understandings. Within this community, the Eichmann family occupied an unusual position. Adolf Eichmann was, even among former Nazis, someone of extraordinary historical significance, someone whose name and role placed him in a different category from the thousands of ordinary SS members, party officials and collaborators who had also found their way to South America. The capture and trial of Adolf Eichmann sent shockwaves through the Buenos Aires German community that were felt for years afterward. Other former Nazis who had been living under false names began to worry more actively about their own exposure. Some left Argentina. Some changed their behavior, becoming more reclusive, more careful. The comfortable assumption that South America was a permanently safe refuge began to erode. This erosion accelerated over the following decades as Israeli and German efforts to track and prosecute former Nazis continued. The case of Joseph Mengele, who had also lived in Argentina and who was eventually chased to Brazil and Paraguay before drowning in 1979 in a swimming accident in Brazil, demonstrated that the Argentine refuge was not impenetrable. The later cases of Klaus Barbie in Bolivia and Erich Priebke in Argentina showed that even after decades, justice could sometimes catch up with those who had run from it. Each of these cases reinforced the message that the network of escape and concealment that had protected so many former Nazis after the war was not, in the long run, capable of providing permanent immunity. For the Eichmann sons growing up and aging in the shadow of all of this, the question was never simply about their father, it was about the entire world that had produced. Their father, the world of Argentine German emigrant community, of false names and buried pasts, of the careful social architecture of collective forgetting that had characterized their childhood. As that world gradually came apart over the decades following the trial, as more and more of the former Nazis who had built their lives in South America were either exposed or died off, and as the Argentine society itself began, slowly and imperfectly, to engage more honestly with its role in sheltering war criminals, the Eichmann sons were witnesses to the long, slow unwinding of the concealment that had defined their early lives. It is also worth considering how the Israeli state itself thought about the Eichmann family in the years following the trial. Israel had taken an enormous diplomatic and legal risk in conducting the Buenos Aires operation, and had been willing to bear the international criticism that followed, because the state had concluded that the capture and trial of Eichmann served purposes that transcended ordinary diplomatic calculation. The trial had been designed not merely as a legal proceeding, but as a pedagogical and historical event, a public reckoning that would document the Holocaust in a way that would be comprehensible to a new generation that had not experienced it directly. In this, the trial succeeded extraordinarily well. It produced a comprehensive and devastating historical record. It gave voice to survivor testimony in a way that no previous proceeding had done, and it established in the most public possible way that the men who had organized the extermination of the Jews of Europe would not be permitted to live out their lives in comfortable obscurity. But Israel hadn't reached into the Buenos Aires suburb of San Fernando to arrest Vera Eichmann or her sons. They were not Israeli targets. They had committed no crimes within the jurisdiction of the Israeli state. They were the family of a man whose crimes were specifically his own, regardless of how uncomfortable that family's presence in Argentina or their silence about those crimes might be. This distinction between the perpetrator and the family that bore his name was one that the Israeli state maintained with considerable precision, and it is a distinction that raises important questions about the nature of inherited guilt and collective responsibility that continue to be relevant today. What, finally, can we say about the psychological and moral landscape that the Eichmann sons inhabited across the 6 decades since their father's execution? They were young men when it happened, ranging in age from 8 to 26. They are now, those who are still living, old men. Klaus would be in his late 80s if still alive. Ricardo is in his early 70s. They have lived, between them, the entire second half of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st under the shadow of a name that the world will forever associate with the organized murder of 6 million people. What that means in the daily lived experience of a human being is something that no outside observer can fully know or adequately describe. We know that they made different choices about how to carry that burden. We know that some of those choices, particularly Klaus's 1966 interview, were choices that caused additional pain to people who were already suffering in ways that did not need to be compounded. We know that at least one of the brothers, Ricardo, eventually found a path that allowed him to engage honestly with his father's legacy without either defending it or making its denunciation the entirety of his public identity. And we know that across all 4 of them, and across the generations of grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have followed, the consequences of what Adolf Eichmann did between 1938 and 1945 continue to ripple outward, touching lives that he himself had never considered and creating burdens that those lives had never asked to bear. This is one of the less frequently discussed dimensions of the Holocaust's long afterlife. The extent to which its consequences for the families of perpetrators, however different in kind and in moral weight from its consequences for the families of victims, were nonetheless real and lasting and in some ways indelible. The child who grows up knowing that his father organized the murder of 6 million people is not the same kind of victim as the child who was among those millions, or the child who survived when other members of his family did not. These are not equivalent forms of suffering, and it would be morally obscene to suggest that they are. But the child of the perpetrator is also not simply untouched. He carries something, even if what he carries is very different from what the survivors carry, and even if what he carries is in some sense a consequence of choices made by his father rather than choices made against him. The question of what is owed to the second and third generations of Nazi perpetrator families is one that historians, moral philosophers, and psychologists continue to debate. Some argue that the children of perpetrators owe it to history to speak honestly about their parents' crimes, to reject any impulse toward family loyalty that would lead them to minimize or deny those crimes, and to use their specific position as witnesses to the perpetrator side of the historical experience to contribute to the public understanding of how ordinary people become participants in extraordinary evil. Others argue that the children did not choose their parents, cannot be held responsible for what their parents did, and are entitled to build lives that are defined by their own choices rather than by the accidents of their birth. Both of these positions have merit, and they do not need to be mutually exclusive. A child of a perpetrator can acknowledge the crimes without making that acknowledgement the entirety of their identity. They can speak honestly when asked without constructing their entire public persona around the act of speaking. They can contribute to historical understanding without sacrificing their own humanity on the altar of historical obligation. Ricardo Eichmann's career and his willingness to give the 2010 Spiegel interview suggest that he found something approximating this balance. His brother's choices suggest that the balance was either harder to find or that they never tried to find it. All of these choices are understandable, if not all of them are equally admirable. What they collectively demonstrate is the profound and lasting humanity of a situation that is so morally extreme as to seem from the outside almost entirely abstract. The situation of being the son of Adolf Eichmann in a world that will never forget what that name means. To fully understand what happened to the Eichmann family after the war, we must also spend time examining the ways in which the broader world came to understand their story, how journalists and historians and researchers gradually pieced together the scattered fragments of their post-war lives and tried to construct from those fragments a coherent picture of what the inheritance of mass murder actually looks like across generations of a single family. The Eichmann case attracted more sustained scholarly and journalistic attention than almost any other perpetrator family case in Holocaust history, not only because of the historical prominence of Adolf Eichmann himself, but also because the combination of the dramatic capture, the televised trial, and the extraordinary global media coverage created a public record so comprehensive and so detailed that the family's story could be traced with unusual precision through the decades that followed. Among the most important contributions to this understanding was the work of the philosopher Hannah Arendt, whose coverage of the Jerusalem trial for The New Yorker and her subsequent book Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, remains one of the most influential works of political philosophy of the 20th century. Arendt's central argument, that Eichmann was not a fanatic or a monster in the traditional sense, but rather a peculiarly thoughtless man who had organized mass murder through the application of bureaucratic efficiency without engaging any deep moral reflection on what he was doing, generated enormous controversy when it was first published in 1963 and continues to generate debate today. Survivors and some historians objected that Arendt had underestimated the depth of Eichmann's anti-Semitism and his personal investment in the final solution, an objection that was given additional force by the later publication of the Sassen tapes, in which Eichmann spoke with a frankness and an ideological commitment that his courtroom persona had carefully concealed. But whatever one thinks of Arendt's specific analysis of Eichmann's character and motivation, her broader concept of the banality of evil proved extraordinarily generative as a way of thinking not only about Eichmann, but about the entire class of perpetrators of whom he was a representative. The banality of evil suggests that large-scale atrocities are not primarily the product of uniquely evil individuals, but of systems that organize ordinary people into chains of command, in which each individual can see only his own small piece of the larger picture, and can therefore avoid the full moral weight of what the system as a whole is doing. In this reading, Eichmann becomes not an exception to ordinary human nature, but a disturbingly possible version of it, a version of what any sufficiently organized, sufficiently authority-respecting, sufficiently ambitious and career-driven bureaucrat might become under the right conditions of political extremism and institutional pressure. For the Eichmann sons, this framing of their father has mixed implications. On one hand, it removes him from the category of the uniquely monstrous and places him in the category of the ordinarily corrupted, which might seem to reduce the stigma of his specific name. On the other hand, it makes his crimes, and by extension the question of how his children have responded to them, part of a broader conversation about how entire societies can be organized toward evil, a conversation that is not about one family's private shame, but about the deepest questions of human moral psychology and political accountability. Whether the Eichmann sons would find this framing helpful or not is impossible to know from the outside. What we can say is that the academic and philosophical conversation around their father's legacy has been and continues to be one of the richest and most consequential in the literature on the Holocaust, and that the family whose domestic life they remember in ways both ordinary and extraordinary is now permanently part of that literature, whether they like it or not. The Israeli state's handling of the Eichmann case also had long-term implications that extended well beyond the execution itself. The trial established several important legal precedents in international criminal law, including the legitimacy of prosecuting individuals for crimes against humanity committed in foreign countries against foreign nationals, and the principle that following orders is not an adequate defense for participation in systematic mass murder. These precedents have been built upon in subsequent decades by the international criminal tribunals established to deal with the atrocities in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and by the International Criminal Court. In a very real sense, the legal architecture created and tested by the Eichmann trial has become one of the foundations of the international system for dealing with crimes against humanity, a system that would not have taken the shape it has without the specific legal battles fought and decided in the Jerusalem courtroom in 1961. For Argentina, the consequences of the Eichmann capture were more immediately political, but no less significant in the longer run. The Argentinian government's protest over the Israeli operation was formally accepted by the United Nations Security Council, which passed a resolution declaring that Argentina's territorial sovereignty had been violated. Israel expressed regret for the violation of Argentine sovereignty, though it did not apologize for or retract the operation itself. The diplomatic incident cooled, as diplomatic incidents between states with no fundamental conflicts of interest generally do, and relations between Israel and Argentina eventually normalized. But the exposure of the degree to which Argentina had served as a haven for former Nazis had lasting effects on Argentina's international reputation and on the internal Argentine conversation about the country's relationship with its wartime past. Argentina under Perón had not been simply a passive destination for Nazi refugees. It had been an active choice made at the highest levels of government to welcome people whose histories would have been deeply unwelcome in the Western democracies that Argentina was simultaneously courting. The exposure of Eichmann's life in Argentina opened a public conversation about the full extent of that welcome and about the Argentine institutions, including elements of the Catholic Church, the police, and the immigration bureaucracy that had facilitated and protected the escape networks. That conversation was slow, contentious, and far from complete even decades later, but the Eichmann case was its most important catalyst. For the German community in Argentina, which was the immediate social world of the Eichmann family, the consequences of the case were felt in more personal and less abstract ways. The Argentine German community had spent the post-war years constructing an identity for itself that emphasized cultural continuity and economic contribution, while carefully editing out the question of what had brought so many of its members to Argentina in the first place. The Eichmann capture made that editing impossible to maintain, at least publicly. The community was forced to confront, in the most public possible way, the fact that it had sheltered one of history's most notorious war criminals for a decade, and that many of its members had known it. Different members of the community responded to this confrontation in different ways, some with genuine shame and a willingness to acknowledge what had happened, others with defensiveness and a renewed insistence that the Israeli operation was the greater wrong. For Vera Eichmann and her sons, navigating this suddenly visible and contested community landscape in the years following the trial required a particular kind of social stamina. They were simultaneously too prominent to be ignored and too private to engage publicly. They were the family that the entire community was talking about, but they were also the family that had the most personal reasons to avoid being talked about. They managed this impossible situation by doing, as they had largely done before, the minimum necessary to maintain their private lives while presenting as little as possible of those private lives to public scrutiny. In thinking about the long arc of what happened to the Eichmann family after the war, it is worth paying attention to some of the specific smaller details that have emerged over the decades from the various journalistic and historical accounts of the family. One such detail is the account of what happened on the evening of May 11th, 1960, from the perspective of the family members left at home. According to accounts that emerged later, Klaus Eichmann was one of the first members of the family to realize that something had happened to his father. The elder Eichmann had a predictable routine, and when he failed to appear at the expected time, Klaus is reported to have driven along, the route his father normally walked from the bus stop, looking for him. He found nothing. The family waited through the night. By the following morning, when it became clear that Eichmann had not come home, the family began to understand that the thing they had feared most, the discovery that had hung over their lives for 15 years, had finally happened. Whether Klaus or the other brothers had any suspicion in the days before the capture that surveillance was occurring is not entirely clear from the historical record. There had been Mossad agents watching the house on Garibaldi Street for weeks, and it is possible that some unusual activity had been noticed. But the operation was conducted with sufficient professionalism that the family apparently had no actionable warning. The capture came as a genuine shock, even if the possibility of such a shock had always existed at the back of their minds, as a permanent feature of the life their father had led and that they had shared. The house on Garibaldi Street itself became, in the aftermath of the capture, a place of considerable historical and media interest. Journalists visited it, photographers documented it, its modest brick appearance, reflecting the modest standard of living that Eichmann had maintained in Buenos Aires, was reproduced in newspapers and magazines around the world as part of the visual documentation of the case. The gap between the physical humility of the house, its small rooms and bare garden and unpretentious construction, and the historical enormity of who had lived there, was itself a kind of commentary on the nature of the life that Eichmann had built in Argentina. A life that had been, in material terms, genuinely modest, genuinely unremarkable, genuinely ordinary. The family eventually vacated the house and moved to other locations in the Buenos Aires area. The house itself changed hands multiple times over the following decades and became simply another property in the San Fernando suburbs, no longer marked or memorialized in any particular way as a site of historical significance. This is itself a small but telling detail about the nature of Argentina's engagement with the history of its Nazi refugee community. The places associated with that history were not, for the most part, preserved or commemorated. They were allowed to become ordinary again, absorbed back into the ordinary life of the city and the suburbs. Only the documents and the photographs and the written accounts preserve the memory of what those ordinary places once contained. Among the most poignant of the lesser-known details in the Eichmann family story is the account of Ricardo Eichmann's relationship to his father's memory in the context of his academic work. Ricardo became, as we have discussed, a specialist in ancient Near Eastern archaeology, working on excavations and research projects in Turkey and Yemen and other parts of the ancient world. This work took him inevitably and regularly to the region of the world where some of the earliest recorded history of the Jewish people had unfolded, to the landscapes of ancient Mesopotamia and the Levant, to the physical and cultural geography of the ancient world from which the people his father had tried to exterminate had drawn so much of their heritage. Whether Ricardo ever thought explicitly about this dimension of his professional work, whether it was a conscious choice or a coincidence that brought the son of the man who organized the deportation of the Jews of Europe to spend his career studying the ancient civilizations of the region from which the Jewish people emerged, is not something that is in the public record. But the biographical fact itself is striking, and it is the kind of detail that resists easy interpretation, that seems to demand a significance without making clear exactly what that significance is. What can be said with considerable confidence is that Ricardo Eichmann's career in archaeology represents one of the more remarkable examples of what might be called the redemptive use of personal history, a life shaped in profound ways by a terrible inheritance that found a way to invest that inheritance in the service of human knowledge rather than allowing it to remain simply a source of shame. This is not to romanticize Ricardo's situation or to suggest that his academic achievements somehow atone for his father's crimes, because no achievement by a son can atone for the crimes of a father, and the suggestion that they could would be a profound misunderstanding of the nature of moral responsibility. But it is to say that Ricardo Eichmann, among the four sons of Adolf Eichmann, found a path through the inheritance of his father's name that was more constructive and more honest than the paths taken by his brothers, and that his example offers something worth reflecting on in the broader context of how the children of perpetrators can choose to live. The question, Of whether any of the Eichmann sons ever visited Israel or had any direct engagement with the Jewish community in Israel or elsewhere is one for which the historical record provides no clear answer. There are no documented accounts of any of the brothers making pilgrimages to Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial and Museum, or to any of the other sites of memory associated with the genocide their father organized. There are no accounts of direct encounters with survivors or the children of survivors. The world of the Eichmann family and the world of those who survived the system that Eichmann administered remained, as far as the public record shows, entirely separate across the decades following the trial. This separation is itself significant because it suggests the extent to which the descendants of perpetrators and the descendants of victims continue, even generations later, to inhabit worlds that rarely touch each other directly. There is a particularly sobering footnote to the Eichmann family story that comes from the research conducted by Israeli historian and prosecutor Gabriel Bach, who served as the assistant prosecutor in the Eichmann trial and who later became a justice of the Israeli Supreme Court. Bach spent considerable time after the trial reflecting on the psychological dimensions of the case, on what it had meant to prosecute a man who presented himself as an ordinary human being, on the difficulty of comprehending how such an ordinary person could have done what Eichmann had done. In a late-life interview, Bach observed that one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case had been the recognition that Eichmann's domestic life, his relationship with his wife and children, appeared to have been entirely normal, affectionate, and loving, by ordinary human standards. The man who went home to Vera and the boys in San Fernando was apparently a decent husband and a caring father, someone who helped his sons with their homework and sat down to family dinners and displayed none of the pathological personality that one might expect to find in the private life of someone who had organized mass murder. Bach found this not exculpatory, but deeply troubling, because it suggested that the capacity for organizing atrocity did not reside in some separate compartment of personality, isolated from the capacity for ordinary human affection, but that the two could coexist in the same person without apparent inner contradiction. This observation brings us back to one of the fundamental questions raised by the Eichmann case and by what happened to his family in its aftermath. The question is not simply what happened to Vera and Klaus and Horst and Dieter and Ricardo after the war and after the trial. The question is what the existence of the Eichmann family and the perfectly ordinary domestic life they shared with one of history's most consequential criminals tells us about the nature of moral responsibility, about the limits of love. As a moral guide about the ways in which institutions and ideologies can penetrate the domestic sphere and transform loving family relationships into the supporting structures of genocide. Vera Eichmann loved her husband. That much seems beyond serious dispute. She followed him to Argentina. She spent 40 years as his widow without ever publicly condemning him. She went to her grave in 2004 without having spoken any honest public word about what he had done. Her love was real. And that love, in its practical effects, was one of the mechanisms by which Adolf Eichmann remained a free man for 15 years, one of the ways in which the network of human loyalty and family solidarity that every social order depends upon was diverted into the service of one of the worst crimes in human history. Vera Eichmann's love for her husband was not itself a crime. But its consequences were among the consequences of crime, and the fact that love can work this way, that the most ordinary and admirable of human emotions can be conscripted into the service of the most terrible of human projects, is one of the darkest lessons in the entire story. The Eichmann sons, for their part, were people who had the misfortune of being born into a family shaped by those consequences before they had any capacity to understand what they were being born into. They did not choose their father. They did not choose the name that he made infamous. They did not choose the lies that were told to them in childhood, the false identity under which they spent their formative years, or the global trial that stripped that identity away and replaced it with a truth more difficult to bear than any fiction. What they chose were their responses to all of this once they were old enough to choose anything at all. And those responses, from Klaus's defiant loyalty to Horst and Dieter's determined silence to Ricardo's tentative, imperfect but genuine engagement with the truth, are the human story that lies behind the historical one. When we ask what happened to Adolf Eichmann's family after World War II, The honest answer is that they continued to happen in the way that families do across decades and generations, producing grandchildren and great-grandchildren who bear a name whose weight they may or may not fully understand, who are growing up in a world that has changed dramatically from the one in which their grandfather organized mass murder, but that has not and cannot entirely leave that history behind. Some of those descendants, by all accounts, live in Argentina. Some may live in Germany or elsewhere. They carry the Eichmann name, or they have changed it, or it is diluted through marriage into other surnames that leave fewer visible traces. They are ordinary people living ordinary lives, and they did nothing to deserve the history that preceded them, and yet that history preceded them, and it will continue to precede every generation that follows, receding in time but never entirely disappearing, carried in documents and memorials and the permanent historical record that the Jerusalem trial created, carried also in the specific biological and biographical fact of descent from the man who sat in that bulletproof glass booth and listened through headphones as the charges against him were read. This is the legacy of the Eichmann family after World War II. Not a legacy of additional crime, not a legacy of successful escape, but a legacy of the long human aftermath of a terrible act. A legacy that speaks to everything we know and don't know about guilt and innocence, about inheritance and choice, about the ways in which history lives in families long after the events that made that history have passed into the record books and the memory of the world. The story of Vera Eichmann and her 4 sons is, in its essentials, the story of what happens when history makes an impossible demand of ordinary human beings, when it presents people who wanted nothing more than a normal life with a burden that normal life has no mechanism for carrying. Some of them failed the demand. Some of them avoided it. One of them perhaps found a way to live honestly with it. None of them escaped it. And that inability to escape, that permanent implication in a history that preceded their own choices and that no choice they could make would ever fully undo, is the most honest and most unsettling truth about what it means to be the family of Adolf Eichmann, in a world that will never forget what that name means. There is a final detail worth noting, one that brings the story full circle in a way that is both deeply symbolic and quietly devastating. When Adolf Eichmann was executed at Ramla prison in Israel in the early hours of June 1st, 1962, his remains were cremated and his ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean Sea. This was done deliberately, to prevent any grave site from becoming a place of pilgrimage or memorialization for those who might wish to honor rather than condemn him. The effect of this decision was that Adolf Eichmann has no grave. There is no place on earth where his name is inscribed in stone, no physical location where his family could go to mourn him in the way that families mourn. His wife could not visit a grave. His sons could not stand over a marker and have whatever private thoughts the presence of a grave provokes. He was, in the most literal possible sense, erased from the physical landscape of the world, his remains absorbed into the sea that borders the country he had spent his career trying to exterminate. Vera Eichmann, who died in 2004, is buried in Buenos Aires. There is presumably a grave for her. There is perhaps a grave or graves for whichever of her sons have preceded her in death. The family that Adolf Eichmann built has graves. He does not. And in that asymmetry between the family that carries his legacy in life and the absence of any physical remnant of the man himself, there is something that functions, imperfectly and incompletely, as a kind of justice, or at least as a kind of final honesty about what his life ultimately meant and what it ultimately cost. Well, that brings us to the end of this exploration of what happened to Adolf Eichmann's family after World War II. We hope you found this video not only informative, but genuinely thought-provoking, because the story of the Eichmann family is one that touches on some of the deepest questions that history raises about guilt, about loyalty, about the inheritance of responsibility, and about what it means to love someone whose life was built on a foundation of crimes against humanity. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more stories from this extraordinary and terrible period of history, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the children of other major Nazi leaders after the war. The stories of Gudrun Himmler, Niklas Frank, Rolf Mengele, and their siblings offer equally remarkable and equally unsettling perspectives on the long aftermath of the Third Reich. And if you haven't already, please do like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so that you never miss a new upload. We are committed to bringing you the most comprehensive, most thoroughly researched, and most honestly told stories from World War II and its aftermath. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you in the next one.